6 weeks. N259. UP sat in San Antonio for 6 weeks of heavy maintenance, September 3rd to October 18th, 2025. Mechanics found rust on structural parts in the bilge area. They found a cracked stringer near the center wing fuel tank. They performed required lubrication on the pylon thrust links and spherical bearings, the very components that would fail 17 days later. They fixed what they found. They signed off the aircraft as airworthy. On November 4th, that aircraft's left engine tore away during takeoff, killing 15 people. The question that haunts this investigation: what did they miss, and why? Let me walk you through what we know about the maintenance timeline. N259UP, a 34-year-old McDonnell Douglas MD-11F, arrived at ST Engineering's facility in San Antonio on September 3rd, 2025. ST Engineering, and a Singapore-based aerospace company, has been UPS's primary provider of heavy maintenance for MD-11 aircraft since 2002. They converted nearly all of UPS's MD-11 fleet from passenger to freighter configuration. This wasn't some fly-by-night shop, this was the experts. The aircraft stayed at that facility for 45 days. During that time, according to FAA Service Difficulty Reporting System records, 3 separate reports were filed documenting issues discovered on the jet. First, corrosion. Workers found rust on structural parts in 2 separate areas in the bilge, the lowest part of the aircraft's fuselage, where water and contaminants tend to collect. Corrosion in the bilge is common on aging aircraft, and when caught early can be repaired before it becomes critical. They repaired it. Second, a cracked stringer. Your stringers are the longitudinal support structures that run the length of the fuselage, helping maintain its shape and distribute loads. The crack was located near the center wing upper fuel tank, a critical structural area. This wasn't a minor discrepancy. A cracked stringer near a fuel tank is the kind of finding that grounds an aircraft until repaired. They made a permanent repair. The jet was cleared to fly. Third, and this is where it gets complicated, on October 18th, the day before the aircraft left San Antonio, mechanics completed a 24-month lubrication task on the pylon thrust links and pylon spherical bearings. This was scheduled maintenance, required every 24 months or 4,800 flight hours. The spherical bearings are the same components that the NTSB has now identified as the failure point. Think about that for a moment. Mechanics had their hands on the very parts that would fail 17 days later. They lubricated them as required. They completed the task. They signed off the paperwork, and yet, the spherical bearing race, the component that cracked circumferentially and allowed the pylon to separate, was not discovered to be fatigued. The fatigue cracks originating around the entire circumference at the edge of the design recess groove went undetected. The aircraft was released to service. Here's what the NTSB has found. The fatigue cracking in the bearing race encompassed roughly 75% of the fracture surface. This wasn't a crack that developed overnight. This was progressive damage that had been growing for months, perhaps years, invisible beneath the surface until the metal simply couldn't hold any longer. How does a maintenance crew lubricate a bearing assembly and not notice that it's about to fail catastrophically? The answer lies in what the lubrication task actually involves versus what would be required to find fatigue cracks. Lubrication is largely an external procedure. You apply grease to the fittings, you check for obvious play or migration, you verify the bearing hasn't shifted position. What you don't do, because it's not part of a lubrication task, is disassemble the bearing, remove it from the housing, and perform detailed inspection of its interior surfaces with dye-penetrant or magnetic particle testing. The cracks were inside the bearing race in a groove that sits within the lug housing. From the outside, during a routine lubrication task, there would be no visible indication of the damage developing within. Boeing's 2011 service letter had warned operators about this exact failure mode. The letter recommended that during visual inspections of the pylon aft mount, conducted every 60 months, mechanics should check that the spherical bearing race hadn't migrated forward or aft, which would indicate potential cracking. But visual inspection relies on the damage manifesting as bearing migration. If the cracks haven't progressed to the point where the bearing has shifted, a visual check won't catch it. When was the last visual inspection of N259UP's left pylon aft mount? October 2021. 4 years before the crash. The next one wasn't due until October 2026. The more rigorous, special detailed inspections of the mount lugs and wing clevis had even higher thresholds, 28,000 to 29,200 cycles. N259UP had only accumulated 21,043 cycles. Those inspections were still years away. This creates a troubling gap in the maintenance paradigm. The aircraft can be brought in for heavy maintenance, found to have corrosion and cracks in one area, repaired, returned to service, and still be harboring fatal damage in another area that won't be formally inspected for years. The maintenance crew in San Antonio did exactly what they were supposed to do. They followed the maintenance manual, they completed the required tasks, they documented their findings, they fixed what they found, they lubricated what needed lubrication, but the inspection intervals set by Boeing and approved by the FAA didn't catch the bearing race fatigue in time. The scheduled maintenance didn't include the kind of inspection that would have revealed the cracks. The system, designed to ensure aircraft safety, it had a gap precisely where this aircraft needed protection. Lawsuits filed against UPS, Boeing, and ST Engineering allege negligence in maintaining the aircraft. One complaint states that ST knew or reasonably should have known that the MD-11F aircraft used on UPS Flight 2976 was in disrepair or was otherwise dangerous and unsafe. Whether that allegation holds up in court will depend on what the evidence shows about industry standards or what reasonably could have been discovered and whether anyone deviated from accepted practices. What we know so far doesn't suggest the maintenance crew did anything wrong in terms of following procedures. They found issues, they fixed issues, they completed required tasks. The problem may be that the procedures themselves were inadequate for detecting this particular failure mode before it became catastrophic. Boeing knew this bearing had failed 4 times before on 3 different aircraft. They knew the failure initiated at the design recess groove. They designed a new bearing that eliminated the groove, but they never mandated the new design. They never increased inspection frequency. They never required non-destructive testing of the bearing race as part of routine maintenance. An airworthiness directive from the FAA would have required operators to take specific action. Instead, Boeing issued a service letter, which is advisory rather than mandatory. Operators could implement the recommendations or not. There's no indication that N259UP had the improved bearing design installed. The maintenance facility in San Antonio performed scheduled work on parts that were ticking time bombs they had no way of knowing. The procedures they were following didn't include the inspections that would have caught the problem. The aircraft they released to service was compliant with all applicable requirements. And 17 days later, 15 people died. This is what keeps investigators awake at night. Not crashes caused by mechanics cutting corners, not failures caused by missed inspections, but failures that occur within a properly maintained aircraft because the maintenance program itself didn't account for a known failure mode. N259UP flew 28 flights between leaving San Antonio on October 18th and crashing on November 4th. 28 takeoffs and landings. 28 times the crew trusted that the aircraft was airworthy. 28 times the bearings held, until they didn't. The fatigue cracks continued growing with each cycle. Each takeoff stressed the bearing. Each landing added another increment of damage. Somewhere in those 17 days, the cracks propagated past the point of no return. By November 4th, when the aircraft rotated for takeoff to Honolulu, the bearing race couldn't withstand the load anymore. For pilots, for mechanics, for everyone who relies on the maintenance system to keep aircraft safe, the lesson is sobering. Following procedures isn't always enough. Scheduled maintenance can be completed perfectly and still miss damage that kills. The system has gaps. This accident found one. The NTSB's final report will examine whether the inspection intervals for the pylon mount components were adequate. They'll analyze Boeing's 2011 service letter and ask whether it should have been an airworthiness directive. They'll scrutinize the maintenance performed in San Antonio and determine whether anything beyond required procedures could or should have been done. Until that report is released, we're left with an uncomfortable truth. A 34-year-old aircraft spent 6 weeks in heavy maintenance. Experienced technicians found corrosion and cracks, fixed them, and signed off the jet as airworthy. The very bearings that would fail were lubricated as required. Everything was done correctly by the book, following approved procedures, and the book wasn't good enough. Captain Richard Wartenberg, First Officer Lee Truitt, and Relief Officer Dana Diamond trusted that book. They trusted that the aircraft they were climbing into on November 4th had been properly maintained. They trusted that if something were dangerously wrong, someone would have found it. That trust was misplaced, not because anyone was negligent, but because the system designed to catch fatal damage before it becomes fatal had a gap that nobody knew was there. When the final report is released, I'll be here. Until then, we have questions that go beyond any single mechanic, any single airline, any single manufacturer. Questions about how we certify aging aircraft, questions about how we set inspection intervals, Questions about what happens when a known failure mode isn't addressed with mandatory action. 15 people are dead because a 3-inch bearing failed, and the aircraft passed every inspection required of it.